On the evening of February the 28th, 1953, Joseph Vissarionovich Stalin, the man who had ruled the Soviet Union with absolute authority for nearly 3 decades, sat down to what would become his last supper. The setting was Kunt-Sevo dacha, his private residence located approximately 15 kilometers west of the Kremlin, a modest structure by the standards of dictators, but fortified like a military installation. The guests that night were the men who formed the innermost circle of Soviet power. Nikita Khrushchev, first secretary of the Moscow Party Committee, Georgy Malenkov, deputy chairman of the Council of Ministers, Lavrenti Beria, the feared head of the secret police, and Nikolai Bulganin, Minister of Defense. These were not friends sharing a meal. They were survivors of a system that had devoured millions, and each man at that table knew that his life depended on the whims of the aging tyrant who sat at its head. Stalin was 74 years old, and the decades of paranoia, sleepless nights, and the crushing weight of managing an empire had taken their toll. His face was marked by smallpox scars from childhood. His teeth were yellowed and broken, and he walked with an increasingly noticeable shuffle. But his mind, though perhaps not as sharp as it had been during the purges of the 1930s or the desperate days of the Great Patriotic War, remained a weapon of terrible precision. In recent months, however, those closest to him had noticed disturbing changes. His suspicions had deepened into something approaching madness. He had recently launched what would become known as the Doctor's Plot, a fabricated conspiracy claiming that prominent physicians, most of them Jewish, were plotting to assassinate Soviet leaders. The campaign had all the hallmarks of his earlier purges, and everyone understood what it meant. Another wave of terror was coming, and no one was safe. The dinner began around 8 in the evening and stretched past midnight. Stalin enjoyed these late-night gatherings, forcing his subordinates to drink heavily while he himself consumed little, watching them with those penetrating yellow eyes, looking for any sign of disloyalty or weakness. The menu was typically Georgian, reflecting Stalin's roots in the Caucasus region. Khachapuri, satsivi, lobio, and endless toasts with Georgian wine and vodka. The conversation ranged across various topics, from agricultural production figures to the latest developments in the Korean War, which had been grinding on since 1950, with no clear end in sight. Stalin held forth on his theories about capitalist encirclement and the inevitability of war with the West, themes he had returned to obsessively in his final years. What none of the men at that table could have known was that they were witnessing the final performance of one of history's most consequential figures. Stalin had risen from poverty in the Georgian town of Gori to become the absolute master of the world's largest country. He had industrialized the Soviet Union through a series of 5-year plans that cost millions of lives through forced collectivization and famine. He had purged the Communist Party, the military, and Soviet society of anyone he perceived as a threat, real or imagined, sending somewhere between 6 and 9 million people to the Gulag system and executing at least 700,000 during the Great Terror of 1937 and 38 alone. He had signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with Nazi Germany in 1939, dividing Eastern Europe between 2 totalitarian powers, then led the Soviet Union through the apocalyptic struggle of the Second World War after Hitler's invasion in June 1941. 27 million Soviet citizens died in that conflict, but Stalin emerged victorious, extending Soviet control across Eastern Europe and transforming the USSR into a nuclear-armed superpower. The dinner finally ended around 4 in the morning on March 1st. This was not unusual. Stalin's schedule had long been nocturnal, a habit that forced the entire Soviet government to operate on his bizarre timetable. The guests departed, undoubtedly relieved to have survived another evening in the presence of the Vod, the leader. Stalin's security detail, members of his personal guard, who maintained a constant but discreet presence, observed him retire to his private quarters. The dacha was equipped with multiple bedrooms, but Stalin typically slept in a small room with a narrow military-style bed, maintaining the ascetic image he had cultivated throughout his rule, despite the opulence that surrounded him. What happened over the next several hours remains one of the most closely studied mysteries in Soviet history. Stalin's routine was predictable and rigid. He would sleep until late afternoon, then wake and begin his work, reading reports, making phone calls, and summoning officials to meetings that could last until dawn. His guards knew not to disturb him under any circumstances. The penalty for interrupting Stalin's rest could be severe, and everyone who worked at Kuntsevo dacha understood this fundamental rule. So when the hours passed on March 1st with no sign of the dictator, no bell rung to summon tea or breakfast, no sound of movement from his quarters, the guards waited and waited. The clock moved past noon, then past 3 in the afternoon, then past 6. The guards grew increasingly nervous, but their fear of disturbing Stalin outweighed their concern about his unusual silence. The lights in his quarters remained on, visible through the windows, but there was no movement, no indication of life. It was not until approximately 10:30 in the evening, more than 18 hours after Stalin had retired, that one of the guards finally gathered enough courage to investigate. What he found would change the course of Soviet and world history. Stalin was lying on the floor of his small dining room, not the bedroom. He was conscious but unable to speak or move his right side. He had apparently been there for many hours, perhaps since early morning. The evidence suggested he had suffered a massive cerebral hemorrhage, a stroke that had left him paralyzed and helpless. He had wet himself, lying in his own urine for hours while his guards stood outside, too terrified to check on him. The guard who discovered him was struck with immediate panic. He knew that he would likely be blamed for not acting sooner. But he also understood that moving or treating Stalin without authorization from the leadership could be construed as an attack on the leader himself. The guard immediately contacted the senior personnel at the dacha, and frantic phone calls went out to the members of the Presidium, the inner circle who had dined with Stalin just hours before. Malenkov and Beria were the first to be reached. Their response is one of the most controversial aspects of this entire episode. Rather than immediately dispatching medical help, they decided to come to the dacha themselves first to assess the situation. This decision, whether made from an abundance of caution or from more sinister motives, cost precious hours. Beria and Malenkov arrived at Kuntsevo around midnight, examined Stalin, and then left, ordering the guards to place him on a sofa, but not to call doctors. They claimed he was simply sleeping heavily, drunk from the previous night's dinner. This delay would fuel decades of speculation about whether Stalin's death was natural or whether it was hastened by those who stood to gain from his passing. Beria, in particular, had reason to fear what was coming. As head of the secret police apparatus, he knew better than anyone that Stalin was preparing another purge, and he understood that he himself might be a target. The doctor's plot was expanding, and Beria's own security services were under scrutiny. Some historians have suggested that Beria may have poisoned Stalin, perhaps using warfarin, a colorless, tasteless anticoagulant that could trigger a stroke in someone of Stalin's age and health condition. Others point out that Stalin's lifestyle, his heavy smoking, his irregular eating habits, his chronic stress, and his advanced arteriosclerosis made a natural stroke entirely predictable. The truth remains elusive, buried in archives that may never fully open. It was not until the morning of March 2nd, nearly 30 hours after Stalin's collapse, that doctors were finally summoned to Kuntsevo dacha. The medical team that arrived was headed by Professor Lukomsky, but notably absent were many of the Soviet Union's most experienced physicians. Why? Because Stalin himself had ordered them arrested as part of the doctors' plot. The supreme irony of the situation was inescapable. The dictator who had imprisoned his own doctors now lay dying without access to the best medical care his country could provide. The physicians who did examine him confirmed what was obvious. Stalin had suffered a major stroke affecting the left hemisphere of his brain. His right side was paralyzed, he could not speak, and his condition was critical. The doctors applied leeches to his neck and head, a medieval treatment that was still sometimes used for stroke patients in the 1950s, though its effectiveness was dubious at best. They administered camphor and other stimulants. They monitored his vital signs and provided what comfort they could. But the reality was that medical science in 1953 had little to offer a patient with such severe brain damage. Stalin drifted in and out of consciousness over the following days, sometimes seeming to recognize those around him, other times staring blankly at the ceiling. The members of the Presidium gathered at Kuntsevo, maintaining a vigil that was equal parts genuine concern and political calculation. Khrushchev, Malenkov, Beria, Bulganin, Vyacheslav Molotov, and others came and went, watching the man who had dominated their lives for decades slowly slip away. The atmosphere was tense and strange. Some wept. Whether from genuine emotion or performative grief is impossible to say. Beria's behavior was particularly notable. According to Khrushchev's later memoirs, when Stalin was unconscious, Beria was boisterous and confident, even gleeful. But when Stalin briefly regained consciousness and opened his eyes, Beria would throw himself on his knees beside the sofa, grabbing Stalin's hand and kissing it. The moment Stalin's eyes closed again, Beria would stand up, his expression changing to one of contempt. Stalin's daughter, Svetlana Alliluyeva, was summoned to the dacha and spent hours at her father's side. She later wrote movingly about his final moments, describing how he seemed to struggle against death, how his face showed fear and perhaps anger. His son Vasily, an Air Force general who had become an alcoholic, arrived drunk and began shouting that his father had been murdered, that he had been poisoned by the doctors and the guards. He had to be removed from the premises. Throughout March 2nd, 3rd, and 4th, the Soviet leadership maintained absolute silence about Stalin's condition. The Soviet people had no idea that their leader was dying. The government continued to function, or at least appeared to, while behind the scenes the men who would inherit power began their maneuvering. Beria moved quickly to consolidate control over the security services. Malenkov positioned himself as Stalin's natural successor in terms of government administration. Khrushchev, underestimated by many, quietly built alliances with military leaders and party officials. By the evening of March 5th, Stalin's condition had deteriorated severely. His breathing became labored and irregular, a pattern known as Cheney-Stokes respiration that typically indicates the final stages of dying. His blood pressure dropped. His pulse weakened. The doctors could do nothing but watch and record. At approximately 9:50 in the evening on March 5, 1953, Joseph Stalin's breathing stopped. The man who had ruled the Soviet Union since the late 1920s, who had transformed it from an agricultural society into an industrial and military superpower, who had been responsible for the deaths of millions through purges, famines, and forced labor, who had helped defeat Nazi Germany and then divided Europe with an Iron Curtain, was dead at age 74. The official cause of death was listed as a cerebral hemorrhage, a massive stroke that had destroyed much of his brain function. An autopsy was performed, and the results, which were not made public for many years, showed severe arteriosclerosis throughout his vascular system, multiple old infarctions in his brain from previous minor strokes, and an enlarged heart. These findings were consistent with natural death from cardiovascular disease in an elderly man, with a lifetime of stress and poor health habits. Yet, the questions persist. Why was medical help delayed for so long? Why did Beria and Malenkov order the guards not to call doctors immediately? Why were the best Soviet physicians unavailable because Stalin himself had imprisoned them? The answers may lie somewhere between incompetence, fear, and opportunity. The announcement of Stalin's death was made on the morning of March 6th, and the reaction across the Soviet Union and the world was immediate and dramatic. In Moscow, crowds gathered spontaneously, many weeping openly in the streets. For millions of Soviet citizens, Stalin was the only leader they had ever known. He was portrayed in propaganda as a genius, a father figure, almost a god. The cult of personality surrounding him had been carefully constructed over decades, and many people genuinely mourned his passing, unaware of or unwilling to acknowledge the crimes committed in his name. Others, particularly those who had survived the Gulag or lost family members to the purges, felt relief or even joy, though they dared not express it publicly. Stalin's body was embalmed and placed on display in the Hall of Columns in Moscow, where hundreds of thousands of people queued for hours, sometimes days, to pay their respects. The crush of crowds was so intense that hundreds of people were trampled to death in the narrow streets around the hall, a final toll of victims claimed by Stalin even in death. On March 9th, his body was placed in the Lenin Mausoleum on Red Square, where it would remain next to Lenin's preserved corpse until 1961, when Khrushchev, having consolidated power and initiated de-Stalinization, ordered Stalin's removal and reburial in a simpler grave behind the mausoleum. The power struggle that erupted after Stalin's death would reshape the Soviet Union. Malenkov initially became premier, but his power was quickly challenged by Beria and Khrushchev. Beria, the most feared man in the Soviet Union, made a bid for supreme power, but overplayed his hand. In June 1953, just 3 months after Stalin's death, Khrushchev and his allies arrested Beria during a presidium meeting. He was tried in secret and executed in December of that year, becoming the last major Soviet leader to be physically eliminated by his rivals. Khrushchev gradually emerged as the dominant figure, eventually becoming first secretary of the Communist Party and later premier, a position he would hold until his own ouster in 1964. The death of Stalin marked the end of an era of absolute terror in the Soviet Union. While the USSR remained a one-party dictatorship with severe restrictions on freedom, the period after Stalin's death saw a significant relaxation of the most extreme forms of repression. The Gulag system was gradually reduced, though not eliminated. The doctor's plot was immediately declared a fabrication. Political prisoners began to be released, though the process was slow and incomplete. Khrushchev's secret speech in 1956, delivered to the 20th Party Congress, officially acknowledged some of Stalin's crimes, particularly the purges of party members, though it carefully avoided examining the full scope of the terror or questioning the fundamental nature of the Soviet system. The final 24 hours of Stalin's life encapsulate the paranoia, dysfunction, and human cost of totalitarian rule. A man who had wielded absolute power over hundreds of millions of people died alone on the floor, lying in his own waste for hours because his guards were too frightened to check on him. When help finally came, it was delayed by political calculations and by the fact that he had imprisoned his own doctors. His death unleashed a power struggle that could have plunged the Soviet Union into civil war, but instead led to a gradual, incomplete liberalization. The system he built survived him by nearly 4 decades, but it never again achieved the same level of concentrated, personal power that Stalin had exercised. Today, more than 70 years after that night at Kuntsevo dacha, Stalin remains one of history's most controversial figures. In Russia, his legacy is contested. Some view him as a brutal dictator whose crimes are comparable to Hitler's. Others, particularly among older generations and nationalist groups, remember him as the leader who industrialized the country and defeated Nazi Germany, downplaying or denying the scale of his atrocities. Statues of Stalin have been re-erected in some Russian cities in recent years, a troubling sign of historical amnesia or revisionism. The archives continue to reveal new details about the scope of the terror, the mechanics of the purges, and the daily functioning of his regime. But many documents remain classified or lost. The final hours of Joseph Stalin remind us that even the most powerful dictators are mortal, that systems built on fear and violence are inherently unstable, and that the consequences of totalitarian rule extend far beyond the death of any individual leader. The Soviet Union that Stalin left behind in 1953 was a nuclear superpower locked in a Cold War with the West, an empire controlling half of Europe, and a society traumatized by decades of terror. The echoes of his rule reverberate still in the political culture of Russia, in the geopolitical divisions of Europe, and in the collective memory of the millions who suffered under his command. As we examine those final 24 hours, from the Last Supper at Kuntsevo to the moment his breathing stopped, we see not just the death of a man, but the end of one of history's darkest chapters and the beginning of a long, incomplete reckoning with the crimes committed in the name of building a socialist paradise.